All right, so our fun warm-up today, and if hopefully more kids will be popping in here. Today is National Meatball Day. So my question was, how do you like to eat your meatballs? But I guess my first question should be, do you even like meatballs? Because I had some kids yesterday like, oh, I don't like that. I don't like meatballs. I was like, oh my gosh. Hi, friend Sean. So I guess the first question is if you like meatballs. And then the second question is, if you do like meatballs, how do you like to eat your meatballs? I just thought like this would be a fun, kind of silly warm up that we could talk about. Earlier today, I had a lot of, spaghetti and meatballs, and then somebody threw in meatball subs, and the whole class was like, yes. What about you guys? Hi, Melanie. Nothing? You have nothing for me? Or hopefully you guys are typing. Hello, William. All right, well, nobody's really answering our warm-up. That makes me really sad, guys. But we do need to... Oh, with rice. So like just the meatballs and rice? That sounds good. Hello, Aiden. Hi, Isaiah. All right, so I guess let's just jump into our Module 9 Lesson 5 course arc and notebook. We never got to question number 4 yesterday, so we're a little bit behind. So I would really kind of like to jump back into that. Hi, Kylie. Since our whole objective is to try and understand fiscal and monetary policy. So if you remember, we answered question number 3, but we're still on the same page in our course arc for question number 4. So as I go over this, I want you to pay attention. The question is, after you read the section on federal budget basics using your own words, explain why you think the federal budget reflects the nation's priorities. Hi, Magdalene. So let's go in here. So we talked fiscal policy. So now we're in the federal budget basics, right? We know the federal budget is a document. Oh, me too, William. Which basically says this is the money coming in, revenue. This is what we're authorizing to be spent in this coming year. But then we know there are certain areas that, like mandatory spending that always get specific amounts. Remember when we looked at the debt clock yesterday and we saw Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the interest on our debt, like remember those are in the mandatory. And then in the discretionary, we know one thing, a percentage of that always comes out, and that is defense, right? And so we saw that on the debt calendar yesterday. So let's look at this. So this is federal spending from 1970 to 2012, right? So in 1970, about $200 billion was being spent for our budget. By 2012, it was 3.5 trillion. And now we're in 2023. And we know from our debt calendar yesterday, we're at 31.6 trillion. Okay. And then it kind of breaks it down, right? Human resources, these are those social welfare programs, defense, interest, physical resources, and then other items, right? So the question was, based on this data, which category is most likely responsible for the steep growth in spending? And we know it's going to be human resources. We learned this in our last lesson, right? As more and more people are retiring, need Medicare or Social Security, that spending goes up, right? So that's going to be the highest growth area. The federal government prepares a new budget for each fiscal year, which is a 12-month period used for budgeting purposes. It's not necessarily the same as the January to December calendar year. It actually, the fiscal year is October 1st through September 30th. The federal budget takes about 18 months to prepare. During this time, citizens, Congress, and the president debate the government's spending priorities. And in fact, the budget reflects the nation's commitment to different priorities. Several basic steps in the budget process. So we know the federal budget has to fund a lot of offices and agencies within the federal government. And Congress doesn't know exactly what they need. So all of them send what they need to the president and the OMB put together like a budget, and then they give that to Congress, and Congress either approves or doesn't approve it. Okay. So let's look at question number 4. And it says, using your own words, explain why you think the federal budget reflects the nation's priorities. And so if we look at it, you guys talk about federal budget as a document that estimates the federal government's revenue and authorizing its spending for the coming years. It is a detailed listing of expected income and revenue sources. It also lists exactly how the money will be spent. It is a reflection of the nation's and the president's priorities by listing the tasks and goals that he finds most important and worthy of financial support. As we have learned in an earlier lesson, point 4, right? Social welfare programs make up the lion's share of the mandatory spending that Congress has already authorized to be spent. It is in the discretionary spending that we see where the nation's priorities lie for the coming year. While defense takes up the majority of what is available, how much can change based on congressional oversight and presidential requirements. The remaining funds go towards what is deemed most important for the coming year. The percentages and amounts can change depending on priorities listed. They can also change based on incidents or situations taking place in our country and around the world as well. And I think 2 really big examples of that would be the pandemic, right? And then the war in the Ukraine, right? You know what? That got cut off. So remember when we looked at the rubric, and this one said we had to have 2 full paragraphs to get our full marks for this one. So those are my 2 full paragraphs. Now, do you guys have to do this? Of course not. You absolutely do not have to put what I am putting. I'm looking. You can put your own words. You can use some of what I'm doing, however you want. But did I meet the 2 the 2 paragraphs in here? Okay. Does anybody have any questions on this? Anything you think I need to change? Anything? No, yes. All right, so the next question number 5, it says review figure 9.2, which summarizes how the federal budget is created. So we're going to look at this infographic. Why do you think the process shown here is so much affected by the relationship between the president and Congress? So remember, when we're looking at the rubric, see there was 4, there's our 2 paragraphs. Number 5, it just says answer the question in 3 to 4 sentences. All right. So let's go back to our course arc. Let's look at this. This is 9.2. So we see federal agencies send requests for funding to the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. The OMB works with the president to create a budget, which the president then sends to Congress. Congress debates and makes changes to the budget and then returns it to the president. And the president has a choice. He can either sign the budget into law or he can veto the budget. If he vetoes the budget, there are two options. Congress can either override the president's veto by 2/3 majority. We've talked about this. Or Congress and the president can compromise and agree on a new budget. We've seen a lot of issues in the last 10 to 20 years where neither one of them will agree. Neither one of them will back down. And so then we end up having to deal with what is known as the Appropriations Committee, where they make veto means to say, nope, it's gone, not signing it. And the only way you can override a veto is if 2/3 of Congress actually agree to it. They can barely agree to pass a bill in the first place, and they only need 50 plus 1%, let alone 2/3. So what ends up happening is they go through appropriation and they try and come up with some kind of compromise, if you will. So let's look at the answer. Well, this is what I have. So I said, ultimately, Congress is in control of the money. They sign the checks. Remember when we learned about this in semester 1, that's one of the powers of Congress, right? The president and the agencies in the executive branch propose and ask for budgets to be approved by Congress. If the president and Congress are in opposition of each other, it can and has caused a gridlock. Budgets have lapsed and we have had government shutdowns. So why is this thing, why is it so based on how they deal with each other? Because if they don't, ultimately, who gets harmed by all of this? The people, right? So can we could add that to there, right? There we go. You can add that or not. All right, so I've got a video in the course arc. It says, what if the US budget was only $100? So it's the idea, they're just trying to show you, instead of thinking 3.5 trillion, right? If we just made it in 100, it's going to show you how it's kind of broken down. So let's go to the course arc. It's a short, quick video, okay? Let me mute.
Have you ever wondered where all the money goes that your country spends? It's a fairly complicated matter, so today we hope to make it a little less complicated while focusing solely on the budget of the USA. The US government receives money each year, its revenue, while its outgoings are referred to as the national expenditure. How that money is spent, or how it's earned, is a matter of ongoing debate, and it should be, given that for all intents and purposes, it's your money being spent. To simplify how the budget is apportioned, today we'll imagine it's just a small household allowance. Follow us on the money trail. In this episode of the infographic show, if the United States budget was only $100, how would it be spending it? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, let's take a look at where the money for the US budget comes from. The revenue comes mostly from you in the taxes you pay. In 2018, the US federal government will have a total revenue of $3.654 trillion. This sizable amount we are going to round down to $100. You can get an idea of how much the total budget is if we say that $1 of our 100 is equal to about $36 billion. Half of the US federal revenue will come from income taxes and a further 33% from payroll taxes. Payroll tax is the money the employer or employee pays for such things as Social Security, Medicare, health insurance, and unemployment insurance. 10% of the total revenue will come from corporate taxes and a further 4% from excise taxes and tariffs. This is a special hidden tax on certain items, sometimes referred to as a sin tax because it includes things we should probably consume less of, such as alcohol, cigarettes, and gasoline. The rest of the revenue will consist of money earned by the Federal Reserve and slightly less than that amount from estate taxes. An estate tax is money the government takes when a person dies and leaves cash, property, or stock to another person. This usually makes up 1% or less of the US revenue. Now that we know where the money comes from, let's see if it's enough to provide for the very large household of the USA. The money the US receives from taxes is the globe's largest revenue, but the US is a big spender. The country will outlay more than it receives, making the USA one of many countries with a yearly deficit. Many other countries have a healthy looking bank balance, such as oil-rich Qatar or or the sensibly spending nation of Norway. As we will now see, the USA puts a lot of its cash into areas other countries seem to care much less about. One of those areas is the military, as you will know if you've watched our military-based episodes. And so, without further ado, we'll now take a look at some hard cash statistics. There are three types of government spending. Mandatory spending is the money that goes towards entitlements for the US people, safeguards such as Social Security, healthcare, and unemployment compensation. This amount makes the biggest dent in our $100 allowance. Mandatory spending is 62% of the entire budget, or $62 from our $100 budget. Social Security will cost about $27, Medicare about $15, and Medicaid about $11. Other mandatory programs, which could include things such as food stamps or many other welfare programs, will take up the rest of the mandatory budget. We should note here that there are fears that mandatory spending will outpace the money earned, as there will simply be too many people to take care of and not enough labor force. This is what happened in Japan, a country with a lot of old people and many young people choosing not to have children. Something else to think about is the specter of massive job loss due to technological automation. As for the $38 we have left, most of that goes to what's called discretionary spending. This is part of the revenue that could change year by year depending on what Congress votes for. The third outlay is the money the US has to pay in interest for its national debt, which has almost reached $550 if we are still rounding down to our $100 budget. This interest keeps increasing, and in 2018 it will be about 9% of our $100 total revenue. This is another $9 from our budget that the US must keep paying lest it default on the debt. This national debt is by far the biggest in the world. After mandatory spending and interest debt is paid, we have about $29 left to keep the USA running smoothly. Where does the rest of the money go? According to the White House, in 2018, about 19 of our $100 will be spent on the American military. This is by far the biggest chunk of the total discretionary budget. It's more or less half of the $38 the government had left before it had to pay the interest on its debt. This means from our $29, we have just $10 left over for everything else, and there's a lot to pay for. The rest goes to other departments, of which there are many. About 50 cents goes to the Department of Agriculture, 44 cents goes to the Department of Transportation, $2 goes to the Department of Education, 26 cents goes to the Department of Labor, $1.20 goes to the Department of Homeland Security, 32 cents goes to the Department of the Interior, 77 cents goes to the Department of State and other international programs, $1.11 goes to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, 21 cents goes to the Department of Commerce, 76 cents goes to the Department of Justice, 32 cents goes to the Department of the Treasury, $2 goes to the Department of Veterans Affairs, and 81 cents goes to the Department of Energy. There will also be smaller amounts spent on multiple government agencies. And there's more still to pay. Quite a lot of the remaining money from the discretionary budget goes into the emergency fund in case of war or natural disaster, as well as current military overseas operations. This involves multiple agencies, departments, and organizations, and amounts to around $2.30. If you add up the entire budget, it is more than the entire revenue, which is just the way it works out each year in the USA. To save a few pennies, the Trump administration has made a few minor changes, such as taking out about 3 cents of our $100 that was previously allocated to arts and cultural agencies. At the same time, Trump has also controversially decreased NASA's budget by about 1 cent. If you watched our episode NASA versus SpaceX, you'll know Trump aspires to send men back to the moon, or later even Mars. NASA was budgeted just over 50 cents for 2018. The budget deficit for 2018 amounts to $440 billion. This is around 12% of our original $100 revenue. It means there is around a $12 deficit, so we've spent the grand total of $112. The question we must now ask ourselves is, will the US get out of debt, or will the debt keep growing? Well, like many other countries, the US can just print its own money, so when in debt, just keep printing, right? Some people think this is not a good idea, as it could lead to a financial crisis, and of course, it might upset the people whose taxes are going towards paying off the debt. A simple solution to the debt would seem to be to cut government spending or raise taxes, but the risk is that this might hamper economic growth. Another solution is to boost economic growth so it grows faster than the debt. In terms of the $100, how can the US use it in areas where it will see higher returns? For example, some analysts believe the US should spend less on defense and more on public infrastructure. Where do you think the US should be allocating its money for the best of the American people? What would you do with the budget? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to check out our other video, Robots vs. Humans. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.
All right, so I mean, yeah, $100, and as you can tell, we always go over our budget, which is why our deficit just keeps growing and growing and growing, right? All right, so the next one that we have on here is learn how fiscal policy decisions impact the economy. So it talks about, like, this is the toolbox that they have. They can increase government spending and cut taxes, which would increase demand and prices and output. or they can decrease taxes and decrease government spending, which would then decrease demand, prices, and output. Any combination, but this is what's in their toolbox, right? So it says, if the government leaders wanted to spur economic activities, which tools would they select? So if they want to increase or expand, what would they do? Trying to get more stuff going. What would be the one that they would choose? Can somebody tell me? Anybody? Come on, guys. I'm waiting for a response from you guys. If they want to get our economy going, well, it's more than just the hammer. So increase government spending, okay? What else? We have increased government spending. Are they going to increase taxes, or are they going to, let me see, I'm looking for increase government spending and cut taxes, or increase government spending and increase taxes? Which one would get our economy moving? So now you need to choose increase taxes or cut taxes. Which would be the other side of that hammer that they would use? Because you're right, William. Increase government spending, but what's the other one? And cut taxes. Good. All right, so the fiscal policy that tries to increase output is known as expansionary. Fiscal policy intended to decrease output is called contractionary policy. Remember, we did this in our vocabulary. And we have talked about like what they can do. Okay. So let's go to the question right here. So 2010 GDP in billions of dollars. So we see personal consumption. We have federal government spending, state and local spending, gross private domestic investment. So it says, what percentage of GDP did spending by the federal and state governments amount to in 2010? Can you guys tell me? We're looking at this, right? So close to like, okay, so that is, oh my goodness, I would need to add it all up, like 1.3, right? Or I mean 3. So like 3 billion. Yeah. Okay. The federal government spends less or buys fewer goods or services. That can trigger a chain of events that can lead to slower GDP growth, which we know that's contractionary, right? We've talked monetary and fiscal policy. Let's go to the question that we have. Question number 6, where we have to fill in the chart. All right, so expansionary versus contractionary. The purpose of expansionary is to increase output. The purpose of contractionary is to decrease output, right? The methods: increasing government spending and or cutting taxes to expand, decreasing government spending and or raising taxes for contraction. The results: under expansionary, to encourage growth, to either prevent or to pull out of a recession. Contractionary is to slow down the economy to fight inflation. So I think, I'm not sure if it will let me do this. Let me see. I think it should do this. All right, so what I just put in there is what goes under the expansionary. And then what I'm going to put in the chat now goes under contractionary. Okay. Hopefully that makes some sense for you guys. All right. So then looking at the graph, and according to our rubric, it says we have to answer the question in 3 to 4 sentences. So if we go back to the graph, because it talks about using figure 9.6, right, which is this one right here. It says, how does this graph explain why the government's fiscal policy is an effective tool for influencing overall economy? So I said, while the government spending only accounts for about $3 billion in 2010, according to the chart, it still outpaces private domestic investment. Private domestic investment almost reached $2 billion in an effort to somewhat match government spending. The spending then spurs on personal spending by making goods and services available. Government spending keeps demand going, which allows people to remain employed and thus continue spending. It's like that circle, right? If you have a job, then you're going to buy things. And the more things you buy, the more they make, the more employees that they need. So it's a big circle, right? All right, so let's move on to the next page in our course arc. Talks about the effects of monetary policy. So it says, have you ever asked a parent for money, like a raise in your allowance, or perhaps cash to buy like a concert ticket? If so, you know that timing is everything. So if your parent was just hit with a huge bill for home or car repairs, you know that's not the time to go ask them for money. So timing is also critical to the Fed. Proper timing can support the Fed's effort to achieve economic growth and stability. Bad timing can impede it. Remember when we watched the video on the Federal Reserve, right? So how then does monetary policy influence macroeconomic performance? That is the functioning of the economy. Monetary policy alters the supply of money. The supply of money in turn affects interest rates. Interest rates affect the level of investment and spending in the economy. Okay. So looking at the figure right here, we see step 1, monetary policy is adjusted. Step 2, the supply of money in the economy changes. Step 3, interest rates go up or down. Steps 4, spending and investment either increase or decrease based on interest rates. So monetary policy can also cause economic activity to increase or decrease. Okay. And then, of course, this is a cartoon where they're making fun of it. Step 1, here's that's going down. Step 2, take it down and flip it. For step 3, it looks like it's going up. So let's watch this video right here on the monetary policy and the Fed, and then we'll move to the next item.
Hey, how you doing, Econ students? This is Mr. Clifford. Welcome to Econ Movies. Right now, we're going to talk about monetary policy by looking at the movie Despicable Me.
Hello, everybody. All right. Simmer down.
Monetary policy is when a central bank or other regulatory agency changes the money supply to achieve specific economic objectives. What? Actually, it's not that complicated. The first thing that you need to know to understand monetary policy is the role of banks and bankers in the economy. Banks are financial institutions that link borrowers with lenders. And although sometimes they're perceived as evil, they're absolutely essential to the health of the economy. People with extra money deposit that savings in banks, and the bank turns around and loans that money out to businesses and individuals that need to buy something expensive. Before giving that loan, the bank analyzes the risk involved to make sure they get paid back.
But you have the audacity to ask the bank for money. Do you have any idea of the capital that this bank has invested in your crew? How can I put it? Let's say this apple is you. If we don't start getting our money back.
The bank also charges an interest rate, which is basically the price of borrowing money. The lower the interest rate, the cheaper the loan and the easier it is to pay back. The higher the interest rate, the more expensive the loan and the more difficult it is to pay it back. Wait, stop right there, that's it. This scene with the pillars shows the relationship between interest rates and the overall economy. If the interest rate is really high, then less people are going to take out loans because they don't want to be crushed by that giant interest rate. Consumer spending on big ticket items is going to decrease, and so the GDP is going to fall. But if interest rates are really low, the consumers can go and buy things like cars. The lower the rate, the more they can afford. So interest rates affect consumer spending, but they also affect business spending in the form of investment. Remember, investment is when companies buy machines, tools, factories to produce more stuff. If interest rates are really high and loans become more expensive, then companies are going to invest less and produce less and possibly even go out of business.
The bank is no longer funding us. In terms of money, we have no money.
And if a lot of companies go out of business, that could cause a recession and a whole lot of unemployment.
Now would probably be a good time to look for other employment options.
So lending and interest rates affect the entire economy. But what affects interest rates? Well, the answer is the money supply. But who controls the money supply? The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States, and it's ran by Janet Yellen. It regulates banks and controls the money supply. Change the money supply affects interest rates, which can affect the entire economy. That's called monetary policy. A committee of bankers chaired by Janet Yellen set target interest rates that signal the health and overall direction of the economy.
An increase in the target range for the federal funds rate remains unlikely at our next meeting in April. But an increase in the target range could be warranted at subsequent meetings.
There's two types of monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy is when the Fed increases the money supply and puts more money in the system. This makes it easier for banks to loan out money, so it lowers the interest rates. That'll increase consumer spending and business spending, which will increase the GDP and expand the economy. Contractionary monetary policy is when the Fed decreases the money supply, causing interest rates to go up. That'll decrease consumer spending and investment spending and slow down the overall economy. Now, the goal isn't to ruin the economy and cause unemployment. The goal is to fight inflation. In fact, some people say that inflation is the Fed's nemesis. Now, normally spending is a good thing, but if there's a whole lot of spending and we're not producing more stuff, then we're going to get higher prices. In that case, the Fed uses contractionary monetary policy to decrease the money supply, raise interest rates, and slow down the entire economy to fight inflation. It's like the Fed's private shrink ray. Actually, a Fed chairman many years ago joked the main job of the Fed is to take away the punch bowl once the party gets started. Some economists think the government shouldn't get involved in the overall economy. But other economists think that some fine-tuning done by the Fed actually prevents some of the ups and the downs of the business cycle. Many economists think that economic calamities like the 2008 financial crisis would have been a whole lot worse if the Fed didn't step in. Now, either way, monetary policy along with fiscal policy are the two main weapons that the government uses to fight high unemployment and high inflation. Whether some banks are too big to fail or whether we need more banking regulation, one thing for certain: we need an effective way to make sure that worthy borrowers can buy things like homes or expand their business.
I really don't see how we can afford this.
Hey, chillax. I'll just get another loan from the bank. They love me.
Hey, thanks for watching Econ Movies. If you want to watch more, go ahead and click right here. If you want to learn other econ concepts, click right here. Also, leave a comment below to let me know what videos and what topics you want me to cover next time. Also, please make sure to subscribe, right? Econ, movies, it's like the two best things in the world. Two best things to me, movies and econ. But maybe not to you, but either way, hey, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching. Till next time.
I love how he uses those different movies to explain those concepts. So hopefully, monetary and policy and how the Fed kind of what they do affects, supply and like what's going on in our economy. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Let's move on to limits of fiscal policy, because that is question number 8 on our notebook. And remember, if you look at the rubric, it says we have to do one full paragraph to answer question number 8. So it talks about fiscal policy can be a powerful tool to keep the economy in balance, but it can also be clumsy and difficult to put into practice. It also, those decisions come at a cost. So increasing or decreasing federal spending is not an easy task, mainly because some of those things that are in the entitlements are fixed by law. In fact, over half of the federal budget has been set aside for Medicaid, Social Security, veterans benefits, paying the interest on our loans, right? You can't change the spending for the entitlements under current law. They would actually have to change the law, right? So, I mean, if we're going to make any changes in spending, it has to come from the discretionary spending part of the budget. So there's not a lot of fiscal leeway, right? Governments use fiscal policy to prevent big changes in the level of GDP. However, it's really kind of hard to figure out what the current state of the economy is or what it's going to be in the future. Will says if economists forecast well, then the lag would not matter. They could tell Congress in advance what the appropriate fiscal policy is, but economists do not forecast well. Most economists, for example, badly underpredicted both the rise in unemployment in 1981 and the strength of the recovery that began in late 1982. Absent accurate forecasts, attempts to use discretionary spending or discretionary fiscal policy to counteract business cycle fluctuations are just as likely to do harm as good. And then you look at the figure. Experts on January 3rd say, hey, we're going into recession. 3 months later, on March 15th, the president goes, hey, we need to increase spending on infrastructure to get our economy going. 7 months later, July 1st, or 6.5 months, whatever, Congress debates and they finally agree to fund the proposed projects from back in March. They start doing the new infrastructure projects. Those don't begin until October 1st. October 30th, experts then announce the recession is ended. January 1st, the infrastructure project spending is just now beginning to impact the economy. An entire year after they say we're going into recession, 10 months later, we're out of recession. All of this stuff that they did up until that point, did it have any effect? No, right? So the question that we have for question number 8, it says, read the quote, then look at the figure, explain how the illustration agrees or disagrees with Professor Will's observation. And it agrees with them, right? In this illustration, economists predict that we're entering a recession on the first day of the year. It takes the president almost 3 months to call for increased spending to help spur on the economy. Congress takes almost another 4 months to agree to and fund the proposed infrastructure. It then takes another 3 months to officially begin the projects, and funding won't impact the economy until the beginning of the following year. Meanwhile, experts announced that the recession had ended within 10 months of it beginning. So if all of their work actually worked, we would have seen it kicking in and working much sooner than it did, right? And I think not all of this copied, so let me finish getting it all in there. So that is my response. As you can tell, I have at least 3 to 4 sentences, my full paragraph in there. We're still in the limits and costs of fiscal policy. It says review the section, political pressures. The federal government is not required to balance its budget, and it almost always spends more than it earns in taxes and other revenue. Remember, we spent $112 out of our $100 budget in that video. It borrows money to pay for the difference. As a result, the U.S. federal government has accumulated trillions of dollars in debt. Explain how political pressure contributes to this problem. And guys, you already kind of know this. We talked about this in government, right? So the president and members of Congress who develop the federal budget and the federal government's fiscal policy are elected officials. If they wish to be reelected, they must make decisions that please the people who elect them, not necessarily the decisions that are good for the overall economy. For example, government officials have an incentive to boost spending or lower taxes. Expansionary fiscal policies are often popular with voters. Government spending benefits firms that receive government contracts and individuals who receive direct government payments. Lower taxes leave more disposable income in people's pockets. On the other hand, contractionary fiscal policy, which decreases government spending or raises taxes, is often unpopular. President George H.W. Bush, he said in his thing, read my lips, no new taxes. And then we got into a bind. He had to raise taxes. He was not reelected for a second term. Firms and individuals who expect income from the government are not happy when the income is reduced. No one likes to pay higher taxes, even when the revenue is spent on a highly valued good or service. So if we look at our rubric for number 9, 9 says that we need to have 2 full paragraphs, right? So let's come over here to our question. And you'll see where it says the president and members of Congress who develop the federal budget and the federal government's fiscal policy are elected officials. Like, that's a big part of it, right? We're talking about political pressure. If they wish to be reelected, they must make decisions that please the people who elect them, not necessarily the ones that are good for the economy. Thus, they have an incentive to boost spending in order to be reelected. To make matters worse, when they increase spending, they tend to lower taxes. Hence the 31.6 trillion in debt we have incurred because of constantly spending lots more than what is brought in. Members of the House are in charge of budgets and approving any money spent in our country ultimately. Now remember, we're pulling from information that we've already learned, right? And they, all of them, 435 of them are up for re-election every 2 years. So they spend a year working and then spend the next year trying to get reelected. That means making their constituents happy, and they are most happy when the government is spending money and cutting taxes, allowing them more disposable income and jobs in their areas. That is how political pressure contributes to our growing debt problem. I don't know how much of this is going to actually go over, so we'll see. Looks like it just... All right, so it didn't do the rest of this. Putting this into there. All right, so there is in the chat the answer, 2 full paragraphs, right? All right, let's go into debating monetary policy. So in practice, the lags discussed make monetary and fiscal policy difficult to apply. The lags and the general complexity of the national economy also make it difficult to sort out how different policies have affected the economy in the past. Okay, that's Milton Friedman, right? Some economists believe that government should emphasize fiscal policy more than monetary policy. These economists are in the tradition of John Maynard Keynes. According to them, government spending should be used to smooth out the peaks and valleys of the business cycle. Other economists are more in tune with the ideas of Milton Friedman. That is, they have greater faith in monetary policy. These proponents of monetarism believe that adjusting the money supply is the most useful tool to improve macroeconomic performance, which we have seen currently today with our inflation, right? Every time the Fed increases rates and increases the interest rate, they're trying to slow our economy down, right? The debate over which approach to take with monetary policy will probably never be settled to the satisfaction of all economists, right? And that is it. We only had through question 9 in our notebook. That's all we had to answer. And that was it for our course arc. So everybody should be hitting submit for their course arc. And you should be submitting your notebook. The last thing we have on here is the Module 9, Lesson 5 quiz review sheet, which, remember, again, every question that we go over in the course arc goes into the test bank for the quiz. So, of course, we have our vocabulary, which we've been using the entire time. Our key points, what is the proper role of the government in the economy, depending on if you're a Keyes or a Friedman person. We talk about how they spend an average of $10 billion a day. We've talked about the federal budget and our fiscal policy. We talked about how the budget is created. Agencies send their request to the president sends it, or to the OMB and the president make a budget, they send it to Congress debates, they either agree or disagree, they send the proposed budget to the president, he can either veto it or sign it. If he vetoes it, Congress can either override it or they have to get together, which is generally what ends up happening. We have talked about if they want to spur or expand economic activity, it's cut taxes and increase government spending. If they want to slow down government spend or the economy, then it is increase taxes and decrease government spending. We looked at the fact that human resources is always going to be the largest bulk of our mandatory spending, especially as more people get older. We were looking at the toolbox and how much they spend. We talked about how the Fed can follow an easy money policy, which increased money supply will lower interest rates, thus encouraging investment spending, or a tight money policy, meaning they reduce the money supply to push interest rates upwards. We've talked about entitlements. We talked about the different views for the economists that they have. Other questions to review. Which situations would result in a government budget deficit is if the government spends more than it collects in taxes. Which is the following is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve Board, the Fed, that's controlling our supply of money. What organization controls monetary policy in the United States? It's the Federal Reserve Board, the Fed. What is the first step in creating a federal budget? That's the agency send an estimate of their spending to come to the OMB. Which of the following government actions is designed to decrease inflation? It's to reduce the money supply. And I believe, I lost my little cursor. Okay, that is it for our review for the Module 9, Lesson 5 quiz. Remember, that is in this week's lesson and recordings page. And that is it. So Module 9, Lesson 5 is going to go on our Q4 grades. Remember, tomorrow is attendance assignments, and then group meet is in the morning from 10 to 11:45 a.m. The code is MVLA Rather SSG. If you need any help, you didn't understand anything that we've done in Module 9, Lesson 5, I am there for that time period for you guys to ask me any questions that you have. And that is it. We are kind of done. We're done like 5 minutes early. Do any of you guys have any questions? Anything you're unsure of? Anything you need me to repeat? No? We're all good? Okay. I mean, I know I went through that pretty fast, but I was worried that I wouldn't get them all done today. And I wanted to make sure that I did get through all of the questions in your notebook for you before spring break. So literally, once you guys submit your course arc in your notebook and your Module 9 Lesson 5 quiz, you can have a worry-free spring break, at least for my class, because you're all done. Awesome. Yeah. Just go back through the course arc. Look at the questions. That will also help you review for your quiz. In addition to the review sheet that I just went over. All right. So I think we are good for today. If no